A fast food employee was fired for giving food to a needy boy. Years later, a well-dressed man showed up at her house saying, "Here is the key to your new apartment." It was a slow, rainy Tuesday night at the Burger Buddy on the corner of 7th Avenue in Maine, and Emily Ward stood behind the counter, wiping it down with an absent-minded rhythm. The smell of grease, overcooked fries, and the faint trace of burnt coffee permeated the air, blending into the scent of cheap cleaning products she'd been using all day. Her brown hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail, her apron splattered with ketchup and mustard stains that seemed to have become a permanent part of her uniform. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered every few seconds, and the old ceiling fan buzzed softly, pushing the stale air around the empty restaurant. Emily glanced up at the clock, 10:17 p.m. 43 more minutes until closing. 43 more minutes until she could take off her shoes, with their worn-out soles, and rest her aching feet. She was bone-tired, the kind of exhaustion that comes not just from a long day of work but from the weight of life itself. Yet she was used to it by now. Exhaustion had become her steady companion. At 32, Emily felt far older than her years. Life had a way of doing that to people like her, she supposed. People who, for one reason or another, never quite got their footing. 10 years ago, things had looked so different. She had been in college, studying literature, with dreams of becoming a teacher. Back then, the future had seemed full of possibilities, each day a new chapter waiting to be written. But then her mother got sick and everything changed. The illness had started gradually, with small things. Her mother, who had always been so sharp, began forgetting simple tasks like turning off the stove or where she had left her keys. Emily had ignored it at first, chalking it up to stress or aging, but the forgetfulness soon turned into confusion, and the confusion turned into moments of disorientation. When her mother started wandering off, not remembering where she was, Emily knew something was seriously wrong. The doctors diagnosed early-onset Alzheimer's, and Emily's world was flipped upside down. She dropped out of college to take care of her mother full-time, thinking it would be temporary. But the disease progressed faster than anyone had expected. The bills piled up, and with no degree, no stable job, and no financial safety net, Emily found herself trapped in a cycle of low-wage work and caregiving. For years, she had worked whatever job she could find, waiting tables, cleaning houses, retail, anything that would pay just enough to cover the rent and her mother's medication. The Burger Buddy job was just the latest in a long line of dead-end positions, but it had one perk. It was close to home, allowing her to rush back during her breaks to check on her mother. Her neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, would sometimes come over to sit with her mother during the longer shifts. But Emily hated relying on her. She was just another older woman in the neighborhood with her own problems. Emily sighed, leaning against the counter and staring out into the dark, rain-soaked street. The drizzle outside had turned into a steady downpour, streaking the windows with water and making the empty road shine under the streetlights. On nights like this, business was slow. Not many people ventured out for greasy burgers and fries in the middle of a storm. She liked these quiet moments, though. It gave her time to think. Even if her thoughts often drifted to the things she tried to avoid, the stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter, the groceries she couldn't afford, the constant fear of losing their tiny apartment. The apartment. It was another reminder of how far her life had fallen off course. She and her mother had lived there for nearly 5 years now. It was a cramped, 2-bedroom unit in a building that always smelled faintly of mildew, no matter how often Emily scrubbed the walls. The windows were drafty, the heater barely worked, and the walls were so thin she could hear her neighbors fighting at all hours of the night. But it was home. It was the best she could afford, and even that was becoming a struggle. She'd had to take out a payday loan last month just to cover the rent, and now the interest was piling up, creating a new debt she had no idea how to pay off. And then there was her mother. The woman who had once been so independent, so lively, was now a shell of her former self. Emily tried to remember her as she had been, strong, witty, always with a book in hand. But these days, all she could think about were the blank stares, the vacant smiles, and the moments when her mother didn't even recognize her. It hurt in ways Emily couldn't describe. But she had learned to bury that pain deep inside. She had to. There was no room for breaking down when you were the only one holding everything together. As Emily's thoughts drifted, a figure outside caught her attention. A boy, maybe 12 or 13 years old, stood just beyond the glass door, hunched under the awning to stay out of the rain. He was wearing an oversized jacket that looked several sizes too big, and his shoes were caked with mud. His hair was damp, clinging to his forehead in messy strands, and his face was pale, thin, and gaunt. She had seen him before, lingering around the restaurant on a few other nights. He never came inside, just stood outside watching. She had assumed he was waiting for someone, but now, seeing him like this, she realized he probably wasn't waiting at all. He was hungry. Emily's heart clenched. She had been hungry like that before, back in the worst days, when the rent was overdue and the only food she had was whatever leftovers she could sneak home from the diner where she used to work. She knew what that kind of hunger felt like, the hollow, aching kind that made your body feel weak and your mind hazy. She glanced around the restaurant. The manager, Mr. Halverson, had already gone home for the night, and the only other employee, Jakey, was in the back taking inventory. There were no customers, no one to see, no one to stop her. Without thinking, she grabbed a burger from the warmer and still fresh from the last order. She added a side of fries, wrapping them up neatly before reaching for a cup and filling it with soda. Her heart raced as she moved. She knew what she was doing was against company policy. They weren't supposed to give away free food, ever. It was one of the first rules they were taught during training. But what was she supposed to do, turn him away? Let him go back into the rain with nothing? Emily pushed open the door, stepping out into the cold night air. The rain was lighter now, but the wind was sharp, cutting through her thin uniform. The boy startled slightly when he saw her, his eyes widening as he took in the food she was holding. "Here," she said softly, holding out the meal. "It's for you." For a moment, the boy didn't move. He just stared at her, his expression a mix of surprise and confusion, as if he couldn't believe she was offering him food. Slowly, his small, trembling hand reached out, taking the wrapped burger from her. His fingers were cold and dirty, the nails bitten down to the quick. "Thank you," he whispered, barely audible over the rain. Emily nodded, watching as he tore into the burger, devouring it with the kind of urgency that told her he hadn't eaten in days. She stood there, her arms wrapped around herself, feeling both helpless and determined at the same time. She wanted to do more, but what could she do? She was barely surviving herself. "Do you have somewhere to go?" she asked after a minute, though she already knew the answer. The boy shook his head, stuffing the last of the burger into his mouth. He wiped his hands on his jacket, then shoved his hands deep into his pockets, avoiding her gaze. "There's a shelter on Maple Street," Emily said gently. "It's just a few blocks from here. You can stay there for the night. They'll help you." The boy nodded, but Emily could tell he wasn't planning on going there. She wanted to press him, to insist that he go somewhere safe, but she knew better than to push. Kids like him, kids who had learned to survive on the streets, they didn't trust easily. He finished the fries, stuffing the empty wrapper into his pocket, and mumbled another thank you before turning and walking away, disappearing into the shadows of the night. Emily watched him go, her heart heavy. She wanted to run after him, to do more, but what more could she do? She was already risking her job by giving him the food. She couldn't save him. She couldn't even save herself. The next morning, her worst fears came true. Emily sat in her manager's office, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as Mr. Halverson, her boss, paced back and forth in front of her. His thinning hair was combed over in an attempt to hide the bald spot that had only grown larger over the years. His face was twisted in a permanent scowl, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. "Emily," he began, his voice cold and flat. "We need to talk about what happened last night." She sat up straight, her hands resting on her lap, already knowing where this was going. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. "I know what you're going to say," she started. "But no," he interrupted sharply. "You don't know what I'm going to say. What I'm going to say is that you broke company policy. You gave away food without authorization. That's theft, Emily." Her stomach churned. "It wasn't theft. He was just a kid. He was starving. I couldn't just—" "You could have followed the rules," Halverson snapped, his face growing red. "You could have called someone, like the police or child services. You could have done a dozen other things besides stealing from this company." Emily's eyes stung with unshed tears, but she blinked them away, refusing to cry in front of him. "He was hungry," she said quietly. "I just wanted to help," Halverson sighed, shaking his head. "That's not your job, Emily. Your job is to follow the rules. And you didn't. I'm sorry, Khan, but I'm going to have to let you go. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Fired to just like that. She stared at him, unable to speak. Her mind racing with the implications. No job meant no income. No income meant no rent. No rent meant she and her mother would be out on the street. She felt the walls closing in around her, the panic rising in her chest, but she swallowed it down. She stood up slowly, her legs feeling shaky beneath her. Okay, she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Halverson didn't say anything as she walked out of his office and back into the restaurant. Jacob, the other employee, looked at her with wide eyes, but she avoided his gaze, grabbing her coat and leaving without another word. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky was still gray and heavy, much like the weight pressing down on her chest. She walked home in silence, her mind numb, replaying the conversation over and over again in her head. She had done the right thing, she knew that. But why did it feel like the world was punishing her for it? That night, as she sat on the edge of her bed staring at the bills piled on her kitchen table, Emily thought about the boy. She wondered if he had found his way to the shelter. She wondered if he had eaten anything else since the meal she had given him, and she wondered if she would ever recover from the decision she had made. As the days passed, she would find herself asking that question more and more. The days following Emily's firing were a blur of worry, frustration, and helplessness. Without the meager paycheck from Burger Buddy, the already precarious balance she had managed to maintain collapsed. The rent was due in less than 2 weeks, and she had barely enough savings to last through the month. The medical bills for her mother's condition were piling up, and the loan sharks were starting to call. Every time her phone rang, a knot formed in her stomach, knowing it was likely another collector demanding money she didn't have. The apartment itself, once her refuge, now felt like a prison. The chipped paint on the walls, the worn-down furniture, and the faint smell of mildew seemed to suffocate her. She would sit in the small kitchen, staring at the unpaid bills, trying to figure out a plan. But no matter how many times she added and re-added the numbers, they never worked out in her favor. She applied for jobs everywhere. Grocery stores, gas stations, cleaning companies, any place that had an open position. But nothing seemed to stick. No one was hiring, or if they were, her lack of a degree and her gap in steady work history made her an undesirable candidate. Every rejection felt like another door slamming in her face, pushing her further into a corner she couldn't escape from. Her mother's condition was worsening too. There were days when her mother didn't even recognize her, calling her miss or asking when Emily would come home, not realizing her daughter was sitting right next to her. On better days, they would watch old TV shows together, her mother laughing at the jokes as if nothing had changed, as if the past few years hadn't stolen pieces of her away. Those moments gave Emily a flicker of hope, but they were always fleeting, quickly replaced by the cold reality of the disease's relentless progression. One morning, as Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, her mother shuffled into the room, her eyes distant and unfocused. She stopped in the doorway, looking at Emily as though she were a stranger. "Where's my daughter?" her mother asked, her voice trembling with confusion. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing a smile as she stood up and gently took her mother's hand. "I'm right here, Mom," she said softly, "and it's me." "Emily." Her mother blinked, staring at her for a long moment before recognition seemed to return. "Oh, Emily, I didn't know it was you," she murmured, her voice heavy with embarrassment. She sank into the worn armchair by the window, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap. Emily watched her mother, her heart breaking all over again. This was the woman who had raised her, who had worked 2 jobs to put food on the table and still managed to make Emily feel loved and cared for. Now, she was fading away bit by bit, and there was nothing Emily could do to stop it. The sound of the phone ringing interrupted her thoughts. She glanced at the caller ID and saw the name of her landlord flashing on the screen. Her heart dropped. Rent was due in 3 days, and she didn't have the money. She knew what the call was about, but answering it wouldn't change anything. She let it ring. A week later, Emily found herself standing in line at the food pantry. It was her first time there, and the weight of her situation hung heavy on her shoulders. The room was filled with people, most of them looking just as worn down by life as she felt. Mothers with young children, elderly couples, men and women who looked like they had seen better days. They all shuffled forward slowly, picking up canned goods, bread, and whatever else the pantry had to offer. Emily stood with her arms crossed, staring at the shelves lined with food that felt like a symbol of her failure. She never thought she would end up here, depending on charity just to feed herself and her mother. But pride had no place in survival, she reminded herself. She had to do what needed to be done. Next, the volunteer at the counter called out, and Emily stepped forward, her eyes scanning the items in front of her. She picked up a few cans of beans, some rice, and a loaf of bread, trying to hold back the wave of shame that washed over her. As she turned to leave, the volunteer, an older woman with a kind face, smiled at her. "Hang in there, dear. Things have a way of turning around," the woman said, her voice warm and encouraging. Emily managed a weak smile. Though she didn't believe it, things hadn't been turning around for her in a long time. Still, she nodded and thanked the woman before heading out into the cold November air. The sky was a dull gray, threatening rain, and the chill in the air seemed to seep into her bones. As she walked back to her apartment, clutching the bag of groceries tightly, her mind wandered to the boy from that night at Burger Buddy. She hadn't seen him since then, and she wondered if he had found his way to the shelter or if he was still out there, wandering the streets alone. The memory of his thin face and hollow eyes haunted her. She had only given him one meal, but what had happened to him after that? It seemed unfair that someone so young could be in such dire straits. But then again, life wasn't fair. It wasn't fair that her mother was slowly losing herself to a disease that had no cure. It wasn't fair that Emily had to drop out of college and abandon her dreams to care for her. It wasn't fair that, despite working as hard as she could, she still couldn't get ahead. Life wasn't fair. And yet, what could she do but keep moving forward? Back in the apartment, Emily unpacked the groceries and made a simple meal for her and her mother. They ate in silence, the only sound coming from the small TV that played reruns of an old game show her mother liked. After dinner, Emily helped her mother to bed, tucking her in and making sure she was comfortable before heading back to the kitchen to clean up. As she scrubbed the dishes, her mind wandered to the job application she had sent out. There had to be something, anything, that would give her a break. She couldn't keep scraping by like this. The stress was eating away at her, and she was starting to feel like she was unraveling at the seams. She wiped her hands on a towel and sat down at the small kitchen table, opening her laptop to check her email. Her heart sank as she scrolled through the messages. More rejections. Each one was a reminder that she was stuck, unable to move forward, unable to find a way out of the mess her life had become. It was just past midnight when Emily finally crawled into bed, the weight of the world pressing down on her. She stared up at the ceiling, her mind racing with worries about the future. How long could she keep this up? How long before everything came crashing down completely? Her thoughts drifted to the boy again, and she wondered, not for the first time, if he had found help. She had tried to do the right thing by giving him that meal, but in the end it hadn't made a difference for either of them. He was still out there, somewhere, and she was still here, barely holding on. With a heavy sigh, Emily closed her eyes, trying to will herself to sleep. But even as she drifted off, the worries stayed with her, lingering in the corners of her mind like shadows. The following days passed in much the same way. Emily searching for jobs and caring for her mother, and trying to stretch what little money she had left. The constant pressure weighed on her, making it hard to focus, hard to feel hopeful about anything. But amidst the grind, there was one unexpected silver lining. It came one evening, when she was sitting on the couch next to her mother, who was dozing off after dinner. Emily had her laptop open, half-heartedly scrolling through job listings when her phone buzzed. It was a message from an old friend she hadn't heard from in years, Claire. Claire and Emily had been close in college before everything fell apart. They had shared classes, late-night study sessions, and countless conversations about their dreams for the future. But when Emily dropped out, she lost touch with most of her friends, including Claire. The message was simple. "Hey, it's been a long time. I saw your post about looking for work and thought I'd reach out. I'm managing a small bookstore downtown, and we might have an opening soon. Let me know if you're interested." Emily stared at the screen, her heart leaping with a mix of surprise and cautious hope. A job at a bookstore? It wasn't glamorous, but it was something more than that. It was a reminder that not everything was lost, that there were still people who cared, still opportunities waiting for her if she kept trying. She quickly typed a reply, thanking Claire and expressing her interest. As she hit send, a small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. It wasn't much, but it was a glimmer of hope, something she hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in weeks, Emily went to bed that night with a feeling that maybe, just maybe, things were starting to shift. But little did she know, this small flicker of hope was only the beginning of something much bigger, something that would change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. 2 weeks passed, and Emily's life had settled into a fragile routine, an exhausting, tenuous rhythm of balancing her new part-time job at the Reading Nook with the care of her mother. The stress of unpaid bills, her mother's declining health, and the constant pressure to find more stable work weighed heavily on her. The good news from Claire about the bookstore position had been a glimmer of hope, but it was only a small step forward in a much larger battle. Emily had learned not to dwell on the weight of her problems, though. Dwelling led to despair, and despair didn't pay the bills. She was in survival mode, moving from one task to the next with a kind of mechanical determination. Wake up, make her mother breakfast, check job listings online, rush to the bookstore, return home, prepare dinner, repeat. The days blurred together, and the relentless routine became her shield against the fear that loomed over her life like a dark cloud. Despite the financial struggles, the bookstore had brought her something she hadn't felt in a long time, a small sense of peace. The quiet atmosphere, the smell of paper and ink, the low murmur of customers browsing the shelves. Emily found herself escaping into those moments, however brief, when the weight of her responsibilities faded into the background. For a few hours each day, surrounded by books in the warm, inviting ambiance of the Reading Nook, she could almost believe that everything was going to be okay. Claire had been understanding of Emily's situation, offering her flexible hours that allowed her to care for her mother. They had slipped back into an easy friendship, as though no time had passed since their college days. Claire would often chat with her after the shop closed, reminiscing about the past and catching up on the years they had missed. It was a comfort Emily hadn't realized she needed, someone who remembered her before her life had become so hard, someone who still saw her as more than just a caregiver or a struggling woman trying to stay afloat. One cold Saturday morning, Emily arrived at the bookstore a little earlier than usual. Snowflakes were starting to fall gently outside, the kind that clung to your hair and melted on your skin, reminding her that winter was settling in for good. Inside the shop, it was warm and cozy, with soft classical music playing in the background. Claire was in the back, unpacking a new shipment of books, while Emily worked the front counter, helping the occasional customer find what they were looking for. By mid-morning, the shop had gotten busier. Emily was chatting with a customer about a newly released mystery novel when the sound of a TV in the back corner caught her attention. Normally, the television in the store played muted news or cultural programs, background noise that blended into the quiet hum of the bookstore. But today, something made her pause. The headline on the screen was bold and eye-catching. Cleveland's own Marcus Jenkins signs multi-million-dollar contract, from homelessness to NBA stardom. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She stared at the screen, feeling a sudden jolt of recognition. There, on the television, was the face of a man she had never expected to see again. The boy from the Burger Buddy, now a tall, athletic man with a bright smile and eyes that were filled with something she hadn't seen in him before. Confidence. Success. For a moment, Emily felt disconnected from reality. Was it really him? The same boy she had given food to all those years ago? Her mind raced, trying to reconcile the image of the hungry, rain-soaked child with the confident, well-dressed man, now being interviewed by reporters. The customer in front of her asked a question, but Emily didn't hear it. Her focus was entirely on the screen. She watched, frozen, as the camera zoomed in on Marcus. He stood in front of a group of reporters, his broad shoulders filling the frame, looking every bit the star athlete he had become. His smile was genuine, his posture relaxed, and the words he spoke sent a chill down Emily's spine. "I wouldn't be here today without the help of so many people," Marcus said, his deep voice carrying an emotion that made the reporters lean in closer. "There were a lot of tough days, especially when I was a kid. I spent years on the streets, not knowing where my next meal was coming from. But people helped me along the way. A kind word, a hot meal, a place to sleep, those things kept me going." Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced back to that night, the memory of it vivid and clear now, as if it had just happened yesterday. The rain, the cold, the way his small, trembling hands had taken the food from her, she had never forgotten the look in his eyes. So much hunger, fear, and hopelessness. Marcus continued, his voice softer now, filled with gratitude. One of the first people who helped me was a woman. I don't even know her name. I was just a kid standing outside a fast food place, starving. She gave me food, even though I knew she could get in trouble for it. That small act of kindness, it might not have seemed like much to her, but to me, it was everything. It made me believe that maybe there was still good in the world. Emily's hand instinctively went to her chest, her heart pounding as she listened. He was talking about her, there was no doubt. She could feel it deep in her bones, the connection between that night and the man standing in front of the cameras, sharing his story with the world. And now, Marcus continued, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips, I've made it my mission to pay that kindness forward. I want to give back, especially to kids who are going through what I went through. They deserve a chance, just like I got mine. The interview ended, and the screen switched to highlights of Marcus playing basketball, making slam dunks and leading his team to victory. But Emily couldn't tear her eyes away from the television. Her mind was reeling, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of disbelief and emotion. She had always wondered what had happened to that boy. She had replayed that night in her head so many times. Especially after losing her job because of it, she had questioned herself, doubted whether it had been worth it. And now, here he was, living proof that her small act of kindness had mattered, that it had made a real difference in someone's life. Emily? Claire's voice pulled her out of her trance. She blinked, realizing that she had been staring at the television for several minutes, lost in her thoughts. The customer in front of her had moved on, and Claire was standing next to her, a look of concern on her face. Are you okay? Claire asked, her brow furrowed with worry. Emily nodded slowly, though she wasn't sure she fully believed it herself. Yeah, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I think I know him. Claire glanced at the TV where the sports segment was still playing. Marcus Jenkins, the basketball player? Yeah, Emily said, her voice thick with emotion. He was just a kid when I met him. I gave him food one night, years ago. He was homeless. I didn't think much of it at the time, but that was him. Claire's eyes widened in surprise. You gave him food? Emily, that's incredible. You've got to be kidding me. Emily shook her head, her mind still processing everything. I can't believe it either. I didn't even know his name back then. I just knew he needed help. Claire placed a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. You made a difference in his life. Look at him now. Emily exhaled deeply, a mixture of disbelief and pride swelling in her chest. She had spent so many years feeling like she was barely making it, like all her efforts, all her sacrifices were for nothing. But here was proof that, in at least one person's life, she had made a lasting impact. Still, even as the realization settled in, there was a part of her that felt conflicted. Marcus had risen to fame, to success, while she had fallen further into struggle. Life had taken them in two very different directions. She didn't resent him, far from it, but the contrast between where he was now and where she remained left her feeling raw, exposed, and unsure of how to process it all. That evening, Emily sat in her apartment, the glow of the TV casting soft shadows across the room. Her mother was asleep and the apartment was quiet, too quiet. Emily found herself replaying Marcus's interview in her mind, wondering what would have happened if she had turned him away that night. Would he have found help elsewhere? Would he have survived long enough to get off the streets? Or would that small meal have been the difference between hope and despair? The questions haunted her, but they also gave her something she hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of purpose. Maybe she couldn't fix everything in her life right now. Maybe she couldn't control the bills piling up, or the relentless march of her mother's illness. But she had done something good, something that had rippled outward in ways she could never have predicted. As she sat in the dimly lit room, a soft knock at the door startled her. Emily frowned, glancing at the clock. It was late, and she wasn't expecting anyone. She opened the door cautiously, and standing there, illuminated by the hallway light, was a tall man in a sleek suit. He was older now, his face more defined, his frame broader, but there was no mistaking him. Marcus Jenkins stood in front of her, holding an envelope in his hand. Hi, he said, his voice gentle, his eyes filled with recognition. I think you remember me. Emily's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she couldn't speak. She just stared at him, her heart pounding in disbelief. I've been looking for you, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. For years. I've never forgotten what you did for me. He held out the envelope, and as Emily took it, her hands trembling, he smiled softly. This is for you, he said. It's the key to your new apartment. Consider it a thank you for everything. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she stared down at the envelope in her hands, her mind reeling with the enormity of the moment. All the years of struggle, all the doubt, the fear, the uncertainty, they melted away, replaced by something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Emily stood frozen in the doorway, her fingers gripping the envelope Marcus had just handed her. The familiar weight of disbelief settled in her chest as she tried to make sense of the moment. There, on her doorstep, stood a man who had risen to stardom, a man who had defied the odds. And somehow, incredibly, he was here because of her, because of that one night all those years ago. The shock and emotion that had been building inside her now threatened to overwhelm her. Her mind struggled to comprehend it all. She had always imagined the boy she had helped fading into the city's faceless crowd, surviving in ways she'd never know. She had long accepted that what she did for him that night was a fleeting moment, one of countless acts of kindness lost to the world. But now that moment had come full circle. Marcus. Her voice was barely a whisper, as though speaking his name out loud would shatter the fragile reality of what was happening. I can't believe it's you. Marcus smiled, a warm, genuine expression that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. His presence filled the small hallway, his broad shoulders seeming too large for the modest apartment. Despite his towering frame, there was a humility about him, a kindness that reminded Emily of the boy he had once been. It's me, he said softly, his gaze never leaving hers. I've been looking for you, Emily. I didn't know your name for a long time, but when I made it out, when my life started to change, I never forgot what you did for me. Emily's breath caught in her throat, the emotion too much to bear. She shook her head slowly, trying to find the words. I didn't do anything special. It was just a meal. Marcus stepped forward, his expression softening, his voice filled with emotion. It was so much more than that meal, it was hope. I was at my lowest point, and you didn't just give me food. You treated me like I mattered. You saw me. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, blurring her vision. She blinked rapidly, trying to hold them back, but they came anyway, spilling down her cheeks. She felt raw, vulnerable, and completely overwhelmed. The struggles she had endured, the sacrifices she had made, none of it had ever felt like it amounted to anything. But here, in this moment, with Marcus standing in front of her, it was as though all those years of hardship had been leading to this. I've thought about you a lot, Marcus continued, his voice soft but steady. After that night, I went to the shelter you told me about. It wasn't easy, but that meal got me through the night. It was the first step in a long road. From there, a social worker found me and got me into a youth program. That's where I discovered basketball. He paused, glancing down at the floor for a moment before meeting her gaze again. Basketball saved my life. It gave me something to focus on, something to work toward. But it all started with you. You gave me the strength to keep going. Emily wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her heart aching with both joy and disbelief. She had always wondered if that boy had made it out of the cycle of poverty and desperation. She had always hoped he would, but deep down, she had known the odds were against him. Now standing here, she realized that hope wasn't always in vain. I don't know what to say, Emily whispered, her voice trembling. I never expected... Marcus shook his head, stepping closer until he was standing right in front of her. You don't have to say anything. You've already done more than enough. He glanced down at the envelope she still held in her hands. That's for you. I know things have been hard for you, Emily. I've done my homework. He smiled gently, his tone lightening. I didn't want to show up empty-handed. Emily looked down at the envelope, her hand still shaking as she slowly opened it. Inside was a key attached to a sleek brass keychain. Underneath the key was a folded piece of paper, an official document. Her eyes scanned the words, and the realization hit her like a wave. It was the deed to a new apartment. She looked up at Marcus, her mouth opening to protest, but he held up a hand before she could speak. "I know what you're going to say," he said with a soft chuckle. "You're going to say you don't deserve it, that it's too much. But it's not too much. Not for what you gave me." He gestured around the small, worn apartment, his expression serious. "I've been where you are, Emily. I know what it's like to struggle every single day, to wonder how you're going to make it to the next one. You gave me hope when I had nothing, and now it's my turn to give something back." Emily stared at him, her chest tightening with emotion. She could hardly believe what was happening. This wasn't supposed to be how life worked. People didn't just show up and change your world like this. But here he was. This boy she had helped. Now a man who had risen to unimaginable heights, offering her a lifeline when she needed it most. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "You already have," Marcus said softly. "You thanked me the moment you handed me that meal." Emily looked down at the key in her hand, her heart full to the brim with gratitude. She felt as though the weight of the world had been lifted from her shoulders, even if just for this moment. For the first time in years, she didn't feel trapped by her circumstances. She felt free. Marcus smiled warmly, then took a step back. "I've got to head out soon, but I wanted to see you in person, to tell you that what you did mattered, more than you'll ever know." Emily nodded, still too overwhelmed to speak. She watched as Marcus gave her one last smile, then turned and walked down the hallway, his figure disappearing into the night. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Emily standing alone in the dim light of the apartment, the key still clutched in her hand. For a long time, she stood there in silence, the gravity of the moment slowly sinking in. She thought of all the times she had doubted herself, all the times she had wondered if any of her sacrifices had been worth it. And now she had her answer. That small act of kindness, one meal on a rainy night, had been the spark that changed everything. The next morning, Emily woke up feeling lighter than she had in years. The events of the previous night played over and over in her mind, but each time it seemed more real. The key to the new apartment sat on her nightstand, glinting in the soft morning light. She had spent the night thinking about her future, about what this new chapter might hold. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to dream. Maybe things could be different. Maybe there was still a chance for her and her mother to have a better life. After making breakfast for her mother, Emily called the building manager of the new apartment complex to arrange a tour. She didn't know what to expect, but the excitement bubbling in her chest was undeniable. That afternoon, she found herself standing outside a sleek, modern building in a part of town she had never imagined living in. The area was quiet, with tree-lined streets and well-maintained sidewalks, the kind of place that felt worlds away from her current neighborhood. As the building manager led her through the spacious, sun-lit apartment, Emily felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. The apartment was beautiful. Large windows, hardwood floors, a small balcony with a view of the park. It felt like a dream, like a life she had never thought she could have. And yet, here it was, within reach. She stood in the living room, staring out at the park below, her heart swelling with gratitude. She thought of Marcus, of how his journey had brought him back to her doorstep, and how their lives had intersected in such a profound way. As the wind rustled the leaves outside, Emily smiled softly to herself. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. Kindness had the power to change lives. And hers had just begun again. That evening, back in her old apartment, Emily sat with her mother at the kitchen table, a gentle smile on her face. Her mother was humming softly to herself, unaware of the monumental shift that had just occurred in their lives. But Emily didn't mind. She would explain it all in time. For now, she was content just to sit there, basking in the warmth of the moment. The weight of the past few years, the hardships, the doubt, the struggle, was still there. But it was lighter now. She had been given a second chance, a chance she never saw coming. And it all stemmed from a single act of kindness that had rippled through the years, touching lives in ways she could never have predicted. As the evening wore on and the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily's mind wandered back to Marcus's words. "You gave me hope." She smiled to herself, feeling a deep sense of peace. Maybe that's what life was really about, finding ways to give each other hope, even when everything seemed lost. Because sometimes, hope was all you needed to start over. The weeks following Marcus's visit felt surreal to Emily, as though she had stepped into a new life. one where things didn't just break down, but instead had a way of coming together. The weight of uncertainty that had dominated her days for years was still there, lingering at the edges, but it no longer crushed her. In its place, a glimmer of hope had bloomed, bright and steady, offering her something she hadn't allowed herself to believe in for so long: possibility. The new apartment was everything Emily had never dared to dream of. Situated in a peaceful neighborhood, it felt like a world away from the cramped, rundown place she had called home for so many years. Every time she stepped into the spacious living room, with its high ceilings and soft light filtering through the large windows, she felt a sense of gratitude so profound it was almost overwhelming. Moving in had been a whirlwind. Marcus had arranged for everything: the movers, the furniture, even the small details like the fresh flowers on the kitchen counter the day she and her mother arrived. The first night in the new apartment, as they sat together on the couch, her mother gazing out at the city skyline with a look of quiet contentment, Emily realized just how much their lives had changed. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe. But even in this newfound peace, Emily hadn't forgotten where she came from. She still worked at the Reading Nook, grateful for the steady income and the sense of purpose it brought her. Claire had been overjoyed when she heard about Emily's new apartment, insisting on coming over with a bottle of wine and a stack of books to help her settle in properly. Their friendship had deepened in the months since Emily started at the bookstore, and Emily often found herself marveling at how life, despite its harshness, had a way of bringing people back into your orbit when you needed them most. And then, of course, there was Marcus. They kept in touch after that first night, though not in the way Emily might have expected. Marcus was a busy man, his schedule packed with training, games, and media appearances, but he never let too much time go by without checking in. Sometimes it was a simple text message: "How's the new place?" Other times it was a phone call late at night when the world had quieted down and they could talk without distractions. Emily found that, despite the gulf between their lives, their conversations felt easy, natural. They talked about everything: his career, her work at the bookstore, the challenges they had both faced, and the people who had shaped them along the way. One evening, a few weeks after she had settled into her new apartment, Marcus called unexpectedly. It was late, almost midnight, but Emily had always been a night owl and she answered the phone with a smile. "Hey, Marcus," she said, leaning back on the couch, her feet tucked under a blanket. "What's going on? Aren't you supposed to be sleeping before a big game tomorrow?" Marcus chuckled softly on the other end of the line. "Yeah, but I couldn't sleep. Just had a lot on my mind." "Everything okay?" "Yeah, it's just, I've been thinking a lot about the past, about how everything could have gone so differently, you know? One or two things change, and I might not be where I am now. And I keep coming back to you, Emily." Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest, but she didn't quite know how to respond. She still struggled with the enormity of what Marcus credited her for, how a single meal, given on a whim, had set him on a path that led to success. "Marcus, you've done all this yourself," she said quietly. "You put in the work, you made the right choices. I was just a small part of the journey." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was soft but firm. "You were the first part. That night, when you gave me that meal, it was like someone finally saw me, not as some homeless kid, but as a person worth helping. That made all the difference." Emily blinked away the tears that sprang to her eyes. She had come to understand that while her act of kindness may have been small in the grand scheme of things, to Marcus, it had been a lifeline. And knowing that made her feel like somehow all the struggle had been worth it. "Anyway," Marcus continued, his voice lightening, "I was thinking I've been doing a lot with my charity work lately, especially with kids in tough situations. And I was wondering if you might want to get involved." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "Me? How?" "Well, I'm expanding a program to help homeless and at-risk kids. It's a combination of education, sports, and mentoring. I know you've got a lot going on, but I thought you might like to help. Your story could really inspire these kids." Emily was silent for a moment, the weight of the offer settling over her. She had always thought of herself as someone who was barely scraping by, someone whose story was more about survival than success. But maybe that was exactly what these kids needed to hear. That life didn't always have to be about grand achievements. Sometimes just surviving, just being kind was enough. "I'd love that," she said finally, her voice soft but sure. "I don't know what I could offer, but if you think it'll help, I'm in." Marcus's voice was warm with gratitude. "I know it'll help, thanks, Emily. You've already done more than you know." A few months later, Emily found herself standing in front of a group of young kids at a community center in the heart of Cleveland. The room buzzed with energy. Some of the kids had just come off the basketball court, their faces flushed with excitement, while others lingered near the edges, watching with wary eyes. These were kids like Marcus had once been. Kids who were hanging on by a thread. Kids who had seen more hardship than they deserved. Emily felt nervous at first, unsure of what to say. She had never been one for public speaking, but Marcus stood nearby, giving her an encouraging nod. He had asked her to share her story with the group, and though she wasn't sure if it was what they needed to hear, she trusted Marcus's instinct. Taking a deep breath, she began. She told them about her life, about the choices she had made to care for her mother, about the struggles she faced. She didn't sugarcoat anything, because she knew these kids didn't need another polished success story. They needed to hear the truth, the raw, messy truth of what it meant to keep going, even when the odds were stacked against you. She spoke about the night she met Marcus, about how giving him that meal had been a simple act of kindness, one that had rippled out in ways she could never have imagined. And as she spoke, she saw something change in the kids' faces. The wariness faded, replaced by something softer. Hope, maybe. Understanding. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then slowly, one by one, the kids started to clap. It wasn't a loud, thunderous applause, but it was genuine, and that was all Emily needed. After the talk, Marcus came up to her, his face lit with pride. "You were amazing," he said, clapping her on the back. "I knew they'd connect with you." Emily smiled, feeling a warmth bloom in her chest. "I just hope it helps," she said. "Even if it's just one kid." "It will," Marcus said, his voice full of certainty. "Trust me, it will." That evening, Emily returned to her apartment, exhausted but content. Her mother was already asleep, the apartment quiet and peaceful. Emily sat by the window, looking out at the city below, her mind replaying the events of the day. She thought about Marcus, about the kids at the community center, about the long and winding road that had brought her to this point. She had spent so many years doubting herself, questioning whether her sacrifices had been worth it. But now she realized that every choice she had made, every struggle she had endured, had led her here, and in that she found a deep sense of peace. As she sat there, watching the lights of the city twinkle in the distance, she thought again of the boy she had met so long ago. A boy who had become a man, who had come back into her life to show her that kindness, no matter how small, could change the world. Emily smiled to herself, feeling a quiet sense of fulfillment wash over her. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't worried about the future. She had learned that life had a way of surprising you, of bringing people back into your world when you needed them most. And she had learned that sometimes, the simplest acts of kindness could ripple out in ways you never imagined. Because in the end, it wasn't about grand gestures or perfect moments. It was about the small things, the moments of compassion, the choices to help, the belief that even in the hardest times, there was always hope. And that, Emily thought, was enough.
A girl reports hearing children's laughter from his neighbor house. When the police investigate, what they find is shocking. The beginning of summer in Millbrook, Connecticut always brought with it a particular kind of silence. Sarah Mitchell noticed it most acutely on Tuesday afternoons, when she sat in her backyard with a book propped against her knees, waiting for her parents to return from work. The silence wasn't complete. There were still birds chattering in the maple trees, the distant hum of lawn mowers, and the occasional car passing down Maple Grove Avenue. But it lacked the usual soundtrack of children playing that had filled the neighborhood during the school year. At 11, Sarah was old enough to stay home alone after summer school let out at 2 p.m., but not quite old enough to go to the community pool by herself. Her mother, Claire, had written out a detailed schedule that hung on the refrigerator door. Arrive home by 2:30, homework until 4 o'clock, if any, reading or quiet activities until 5:30, when either mom or dad would be home. No cooking, no friends over, no answering the door. "You're my responsible girl," Claire had said, kissing the top of Sarah's head before rushing off to another early morning meeting at the insurance company. "I know you'll make good choices. Sarah took her responsibility seriously, even if it meant spending long afternoons alone with her books and her thoughts. Today she was attempting to read The Secret Garden for the third time, but the humid June air made it difficult to concentrate. She shifted on the wooden bench her father had built last summer, trying to find a comfortable position that wouldn't stick to her skin. That's when she heard it, children's laughter, bright and clear, floating over the tall privacy fence from Mrs. Walsh's yard next door. Sarah sat up straighter, marking her place in the book with her finger. In the 3 years they'd lived in this house, she'd never heard children at the Walsh place. Mrs. Eleanor Walsh lived alone in the imposing Victorian home, a widow who rarely emerged except to receive her weekly grocery delivery or to clip at her rose bushes in the early morning hours. Sarah's mother called her a character, in that particular tone adults used when they meant something else entirely. The laughter came again, this time accompanied by what sounded like a game of tag. Running feet, breathless giggles, and a young voice calling out, "You can't catch me?" Sarah closed her book entirely and moved closer to the fence. There were definitely at least 2 children playing, maybe more. Standing on her tiptoes, Sarah could just see over the fence if she stretched. Mrs. Walsh's backyard was as immaculate as ever, with its perfectly trimmed lawn and carefully tended flower beds. But there was no one in sight. The curtains in the bay window were drawn, as they always were, though Sarah thought she saw one twitch slightly. "Hello?" she called out softly, then felt foolish. The laughter continued for a moment longer, then faded away like a radio being turned down gradually. That evening, over a dinner of delivered pizza, Dad was working late again. Sarah mentioned what she'd heard to her mother. "Mrs. Walsh must have visitors," she said, picking the mushrooms off her slice and arranging them in a neat line on her paper plate. "I heard kids playing in her yard today." Claire Mitchell looked up from her phone, where she'd been answering work emails between bites. "That's nice," she said absently. "It's good she's having family over. That house is too big for one person anyway." She frowned at something on her screen and began typing rapidly. "But I didn't see anyone," Sarah persisted. "I looked over the fence and the yard was empty." Her mother finally put the phone down, but only to give Sarah a mildly reproachful look. "Sarah, what have we said about respecting people's privacy? No peeking into neighbors' yards." "I wasn't peeking exactly. I just wanted to see who was playing. Maybe they could come over sometime." The words came out more wistfully than Sarah had intended. She'd had trouble making friends since they'd moved here. Most of the kids in the neighborhood were either much younger or teenagers who weren't interested in hanging out with a 6th grader. Claire's expression softened. "Oh, honey, I know the summer can feel long. Why don't we look into some day camps? There must be something still open for July." She picked up her phone again, presumably to add it to her endless to-do list. Sarah pushed her plate away, no longer hungry. "It's okay, Mom. I like reading in the yard." It wasn't exactly a lie, she did like reading. She just wished she had someone to talk to about the books afterward. Later that night, Sarah lay in bed with her window open, letting in the cooler evening air. Her room faced the Walsh house, and through the gap in her curtains, she could see the dim glow of lights behind Mrs. Walsh's drawn shades. Just as she was drifting off to sleep, the laughter came again, the same bright, clear sound she'd heard that afternoon. But this time, it was followed by something else. The soft, tinny quality of music that reminded Sarah of the antique music box her grandmother kept on her dresser. Sarah sat up in bed, fully awake now. The sound was exactly the same as before, not similar, but identical down to the pattern of giggles and the "you can't catch me." She reached for her notebook on the bedside table, the one where she kept story ideas and observations. At the top of a fresh page, she wrote, "Tuesday, June 15th, children's laughter at Mrs. Walsh's house. 3:15 p.m. and 10:22 p.m. Exactly the same both times." She underlined exactly twice, then added, "No children visible in yard." The sounds faded away again, leaving only the normal nighttime noises of crickets and distant traffic. Sarah lay back down, but sleep was a long time coming. She kept thinking about Mrs. Walsh's house, with its drawn curtains and perfect roses and the mystery of laughter that played like a recording on repeat. Just before she finally drifted off, Sarah remembered something she'd noticed but hadn't really processed earlier. The children's voices had sounded old-fashioned somehow, like characters in the black and white TV shows her grandmother sometimes watched. Their accent was different, crisper, more formal, and their words had that slight echo that old recordings always seemed to have. But that was silly, wasn't it? Why would anyone play recordings of children laughing? In her last conscious moments, Sarah made a decision. Tomorrow, she would start paying closer attention to the house next door. She would write down every time she heard the laughter, every movement behind the curtains, every coming and going. Maybe there was nothing strange happening at all, but the detective in her latest mystery novel always said that writing things down was the first step to solving any puzzle. She couldn't have known then how important her notebook would become, or how her summer of careful observation would ultimately unravel a mystery far more complex and heartbreaking than anything she could have imagined. By the third week of June, Sarah's notebook had developed a precise schedule of the laughter. The first daily occurrence was always at 7:15 a.m., just as she was getting ready for summer school. The second came at 3:15 p.m., when the afternoon heat was at its peak. The final replay, and Sarah was now certain it was a replay, occurred at 10:22 p.m., like a peculiar bedtime ritual. Day 15, she wrote in her notebook, using her best cursive. Same pattern. Located source of, "You can't catch me. It's coming from the second floor window, east side." Mrs. Walsh's lights were on at 4 a.m. again. Sarah sat cross-legged on her window seat, squinting through her binoculars at the Walsh house. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Victorians' weather-worn shingles, highlighting the peeling paint around the window frames. She'd borrowed the binoculars from her father's study, justifying it as necessary research equipment. A movement caught her eye, Mrs. Walsh in her garden, as predictable as the recorded laughter. The elderly woman wore her usual outfit, a faded floral house dress and a wide-brimmed straw hat, even though the sun had barely cleared the horizon. She moved between her roses with deliberate steps, speaking softly to herself or perhaps to the flowers. Sarah adjusted the focus, noticing how Mrs. Walsh's hands trembled as she worked. Every few minutes, the old woman would pause and look over her shoulder at something Sarah couldn't see, nodding as if responding to an unheard question. "Honey, what are you doing?" Sarah jumped, nearly dropping the binoculars. Her mother stood in the doorway, already dressed for work in her charcoal gray suit, looking concerned. "Bird watching," Sarah said quickly, lowering the binoculars. "There's a cardinal family nesting in the oak tree," Claire Mitchell sighed, crossing the room to sit beside her daughter. "Sarah, you're watching Mrs. Walsh again, aren't you?" She placed a gentle hand on Sarah's knee. "I know you're curious about the sounds you've been hearing, but spying on our neighbors isn't the answer." "But Mom, something's wrong," Sarah protested, flipping open her notebook. "Look, I've been keeping track. The laughter plays at exactly the same times every day, and it's always the same recording. And Mrs. Walsh is acting strange. Last night she was in her garden at 4 in the morning, talking to someone who wasn't there." Claire scanned the neat rows of observations, her expression shifting from mild concern to something more serious. "You've been staying up until 4 in the morning?" "No, I just happened to wake up and saw her through my window." Sarah pointed to her latest entry. "And look at this, yesterday, I saw shadows moving past the upstairs windows, but they were too small to be Mrs. Walsh. They looked like children, but we never see any children actually going in or out of the house." "Sarah," her mother's voice took on the firm tone that meant the conversation was about to end. "I know you have an active imagination, and I love that about you. But Mrs. Walsh is a private person who deserves her privacy. Maybe she has a radio playing, or maybe she likes to watch old home movies. It's not our business. But, no buts. I want you to promise me you'll stop this surveillance and give your father back his binoculars." Claire stood up, smoothing her skirt. "Why don't you spend some time at the library today? They're having a summer reading program that might be fun." Sarah slumped against the window. "Fine," she mumbled, though she had no intention of stopping her investigation. Her mother paused at the door. "And Sarah, Try to make some real friends this summer. Okay? Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned that you've been eating lunch alone at summer school. After her mother left, Sarah returned to her observation post, this time without the binoculars. Mrs. Walsh had finished with her roses and was standing completely still in the middle of her garden, head tilted as if listening intently. As Sarah watched, the old woman suddenly smiled and reached out her hands, as if to take the hands of invisible children. Just then, right on schedule at 7:15 a.m., the laughter began playing. Mrs. Walsh started swaying gently, conducting an unseen orchestra with her gardening shears. The movement caused her hat to slip, revealing hair that hadn't been properly brushed in what looked like days. Sarah wrote in her notebook, "She's dancing with them. She thinks they're real." Throughout the rest of the morning, Sarah noticed other oddities she might have missed if she hadn't been paying such close attention. The grocery delivery man came as usual, but instead of his normal quick drop-off, he spent several minutes knocking and calling through the mail slot before Mrs. Walsh finally answered. Sarah couldn't hear their conversation, but she saw the delivery man's troubled expression as he left. At summer school that afternoon, Sarah found herself distracted from Mrs. Rodriguez's math lesson by thoughts of the Walsh house. She began sketching a floor plan of the Victorian in her notebook, marking the windows where she'd seen movement and the spots where the laughter seemed loudest. Sarah? The answer to question 12. She looked up to find Mrs. Rodriguez and the rest of the class staring at her. Sorry? What was the question? After class, Mrs. Rodriguez asked her to stay behind. Sarah expected another lecture about paying attention, but instead, the counselor studied her with kind eyes. "Is everything okay at home, Sarah? You seem distracted lately." Sarah hesitated. Mrs. Rodriguez was different from other adults. She actually listened when kids talked. But would she just dismiss Sarah's concerns like everyone else? "Can I tell you something weird?" Sarah asked finally. "Something that might sound crazy?" Mrs. Rodriguez pulled up a chair. "Those are often the most important things to tell." Sarah opened her notebook and began to explain. She told Mrs. Rodriguez everything: the scheduled laughter, Mrs. Walsh's strange behavior, the moving shadows, the 4 a.m. gardening sessions. As she spoke, she watched the counselor's face carefully for signs of disbelief. But Mrs. Rodriguez didn't laugh or dismiss her concerns. Instead, she asked careful questions. How long had this been going on? Had Sarah ever seen any actual children? What exactly did the laughter sound like? Would you be able to record it? Mrs. Rodriguez asked finally. "The laughter, on your phone." Sarah brightened. "I can try. It always plays at 3:15. That's..." She checked the clock. "In about 20 minutes. Let's take a walk," Mrs. Rodriguez suggested, standing up. Past Mrs. Walsh's house. Sometimes it helps to have a second set of eyes and ears. As they walked the 3 blocks to Maple Grove Avenue, Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. Finally, an adult was taking her seriously. But as they approached the Walsh house, something was different. The front door stood wide open, letting the afternoon heat pour into the dim interior. And instead of the usual recorded laughter, they heard something else. A child crying, high and frightened, followed by Mrs. Walsh's voice calling out, "Mama's coming, darlings. Mama will make it all better." Mrs. Rodriguez grabbed Sarah's arm. "Stay here," she said firmly, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling the police." Sarah stood rooted to the spot as Mrs. Rodriguez made the call, her heart pounding. Through the open door, she could see movement in the shadowy foyer, small shapes darting past, too quick to make out clearly. The crying continued, but now it seemed to be coming from multiple sources, overlapping like the layers of an echo. Then Mrs. Walsh appeared in the doorway, her white hair wild around her face. She was still wearing her gardening clothes, but now they were smeared with what looked like food and dirt. In her arms, she cradled something that Sarah couldn't quite see. "Mrs. Walsh," Sarah called out, taking a step forward despite Mrs. Rodriguez's warning grip on her shoulder. The old woman's head snapped up, her eyes focusing on Sarah with startling clarity. "You can hear them too, can't you?" she asked, her voice trembling with excitement. You can hear my children playing? Before Sarah could answer, Mrs. Walsh retreated into the house, pulling the door closed with a decisive click. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by the familiar recorded laughter, right on schedule at 3:15 p.m. Sarah looked up at Mrs. Rodriguez, whose face had gone pale. "I've been hearing ghost children, haven't I?" she whispered. Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head slowly, still staring at the closed door. "No, Sarah. I'm afraid this might be something much worse than ghosts." In the distance, they could hear police sirens approaching, their wail mixing with the cheerful sound of children's laughter that continued to play behind the Walsh house's drawn curtains, oblivious to the darkness that was about to be revealed. Eleanor Walsh's day began, as it had for the past 47 years, with the sound of children laughing. Only now, instead of rushing downstairs to make breakfast for her own children, she carefully adjusted the ancient tape player's volume, ensuring the beloved sounds filled every corner of the Victorian home through the speaker system her late husband had installed decades ago. "Good morning, my darlings," she called out, her trembling hands smoothing the wrinkles from her house dress. The mirror in her bedroom showed a woman she sometimes failed to recognize: thin white hair, deep lines around her mouth, eyes that didn't quite focus the way they used to. But her children wouldn't care about that. Children love unconditionally, don't they? The youngest one, Tommy, peeked around the doorframe. "Morning, Gran," he whispered, thumb firmly planted in his mouth. Eleanor smiled at the 4-year-old, pretending not to notice how his image flickered like a candle flame, overlapping with memories of her own Tommy at that age, playing hide and seek in these same hallways. "Breakfast time," she announced to the empty hallway. "Katie, Michael, come down now, dears. You know the schedule." The schedule was everything. Eleanor had learned that in the 6 months since Jennifer had left the children with her, her granddaughter had promised to return in a week. "Just needed to sort some things out," she'd said, eyes darting nervously around the kitchen. Eleanor hadn't seen her since, but that was fine. She understood about needing time. Hadn't she herself needed time after Charles died? The children were safe with her. They were loved. In the kitchen, Eleanor began her morning routine. 6 bowls of cereal, 3 real, 3 pretend. The children from the recordings needed to eat too, after all. They were all her children now, separated only by thin layers of time that seemed increasingly permeable. "Eat up, Katie," she urged the 6-year-old, who sat picking at her Cheerios. The real Katie, not the one from the tapes, although sometimes Eleanor had trouble telling the difference. Growing girls need their breakfast. Katie glanced toward her older brother Michael, who sat reading a dog-eared copy of The Hardy Boys he'd found in the attic. At 8, he had appointed himself protector of his younger siblings, a role that manifested mainly in silence and watchful eyes. Gran," he said carefully, using the name they'd adopted after Jennifer left them here. "The milk's gone bad again." Eleanor blinked at the bowls, noticing for the first time the sour smell and yellowed color of the milk. When had she bought it? The days blended together lately, marked only by the regular deliveries and the scheduled playings of her precious recordings. "Not to worry, darling. We'll have dry cereal today. Like camping." She began humming along with the tape playing overhead children's voices from 1962. Her own babies playing in this very kitchen. The sound system Charles had installed still worked perfectly, filling every room with memories. Michael exchanged another look with Katie, one of many silent conversations Eleanor pretended not to notice. She busied herself instead with the morning medications. So many pills these days, though she couldn't always remember what they were for. Some days she forgot to take them entirely, and those were the days when past and present braided together most completely, when she could almost believe all her children were here at once, playing together across the decades. The doorbell rang, the grocery delivery. Eleanor froze, her hand halfway to her mouth with the morning's pills. The children knew the drill. Up to the secret playroom quickly and quietly. No one could know they were here. Jennifer had been very clear about that. "Social services," she'd said, her hands shaking as she'd handed over Tommy. "They'll take them away. You won't let that happen, will you, Grandma?" Eleanor watched as Michael led his siblings upstairs, their feet silent on the carpeted steps from years of practice. Such good children, so well behaved. Not like the ones on the recordings who laughed and shouted with abandon. The doorbell rang again, more insistently. Eleanor hurried to answer it, plastering on her company smile. The delivery man, Ryan, looked concerned today. "Mrs. Walsh," he said, holding out the weekly groceries. "Are you feeling all right? I thought I heard children in there." "Just the radio," she said smoothly, the lie familiar on her tongue. "I like the company." He hesitated. "Mrs. Walsh, some of the neighbors have been worried. Maybe I could come in for a minute? Help you put these away?" "No." The word came out sharper than she'd intended. Eleanor softened her voice. "No, thank you. I'm quite capable. Just a bit tired today." She took the groceries and closed the door firmly, letting out a shaky breath. Through the peephole, she watched him stand there for a long moment before finally turning away. She would need to be more careful. The neighbors were watching, especially that girl next door with her binoculars and notebook. The rest of the morning passed in its usual routine. Eleanor helped Tommy with his letters while Katie drew pictures and Michael read. The other children, the ones from the tapes, played their endless game of tag upstairs, their laughter a comforting soundtrack to the day. But something was wrong. The edges of things seemed blurrier than usual, and Eleanor kept losing track of which children were real and which were memories. Had she given Tommy his bath last night? When was the last time she'd done laundry? There were piles of dishes in the sink that she didn't remember using. "Time for your medicine, Gran," Michael said, startling her from her thoughts. He held out her pill organizer, the one Charles had bought her before. Before what? She couldn't remember. "Such a thoughtful boy," she murmured, taking the pills obediently. "Just like your grandfather." "I never met grandfather," Michael said quietly. "He died before I was born." Eleanor stared at him, confused. That couldn't be right. Charles had just been here yesterday, installing the speakers, saying how the children would love having music in every room. The afternoon heat was oppressive, making it hard to think. Eleanor found herself in the garden without quite remembering how she got there, talking to children who flickered in and out of existence like fireflies. The roses needed pruning. Charles had always said a well-tended garden was a sign of a well-tended mind. "Mrs. Walsh," a voice called out, the girl from next door. Eleanor turned to see her standing with a woman she didn't recognize. Why were they looking at her like that? And why was the front door open? Tommy was crying upstairs. No, not Tommy. The Tommy from the tapes. But she could see him, couldn't she? Right there on the stairs, holding his scratched knee from when he fell in 1962. "You can hear them too? Can't you?" she asked the girl eagerly. "You can hear my children playing?" But the girl's face showed only fear, and Eleanor suddenly remembered she wasn't supposed to talk about the children. Jennifer would be angry. She hurried inside, clutching her treasured rag doll. When had she picked that up? And closed the door against the concerned faces outside. The recorded laughter began playing right on schedule, but it sounded different now, distorted and wrong. Eleanor sank to the floor, holding her head in her hands. Something was wrong with the timing, with the borders between then and now. She could hear sirens in the distance. "Michael," she called out, her voice shaking. "Katie? Tommy? We're here, Gran," Michael answered, appearing at her side. His small hand found hers, solid and warm and real. "We're all here." Eleanor squeezed his hand, anchoring herself to the present moment. She could hear people at the door now, official-sounding voices asking her to open up. But she couldn't, could she? She had to protect the children. All of them, the ones from now and then, real and recorded, living and remembered. "It's okay," Michael said softly, as Katie and Tommy joined them in the foyer. "Maybe it's time to let someone help us." Eleanor looked at her great-grandchildren. Really looked at them for the first time in what might have been days. Their unwashed hair, their too small clothes, the worry in their young eyes. When had she last bought them new clothes? Had she remembered to feed them lunch today? The recorded laughter played on overhead, but Eleanor finally heard it for what it was, an echo of the past, not a promise of the present. As the knocking at the door grew more insistent, she pulled all 3 children close, breathing in the very real scent of their unwashed hair and sweaty skin. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was apologizing to them or to her own children, long grown and gone. "I'm so sorry." Then she stood up on shaky legs and, still holding Tommy's small hand, walked to the door to face whatever came next. Detective Laura Chun had responded to hundreds of welfare checks in her 15 years with the Millbrook Police Department, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the school counselor's carefully controlled voice when she called it in, or the way the 11-year-old witness clutched her notebook like a shield. Or perhaps it was the haunting sound of children's laughter drifting from the old Victorians' open windows, too crisp and clear to be coming from actual kids. "Mrs. Walsh." She knocked firmly on the heavy oak door. "This is Detective Chun with the Millbrook Police. We need to speak with you." Beside her, Officer Marcus Torres shifted uncomfortably in the summer heat. "Kids are definitely in there," he murmured. "I can hear movement upstairs." Sarah Mitchell, the young neighbor who'd first reported her concerns, stood on the sidewalk with her counselor, Mrs. Rodriguez. The girl was still writing in her notebook, documenting everything with remarkable attention to detail. "Mrs. Walsh, we're coming in." Chun nodded to Torres, who began working on the lock. The laughter track, and Chun was now certain it was a recording, played on, creating an eerie soundtrack to their entry. The foyer smelled of dust and roses, with an underlying hint of spoiled food. Chen's flashlight beam revealed walls covered in photographs, dozens, maybe hundreds of them, spanning what looked like several decades. Children in varying styles of clothes, from black and white images of the 1960s to color Polaroids of the 80s, all showing the same 3 or 4 kids at different ages. "Police! Mrs. Walsh!" Torres called out, his hand resting cautiously on his holster. They found her in the living room, sitting in an antique armchair with 3 children huddled close to her. The oldest, a boy of about 8, stood slightly in front of his siblings in a protective stance. All 3 kids were unwashed but appeared physically unharmed. "Hello, officers." Mrs. Walsh's voice was surprisingly steady. "I suppose you're here about the children." Chun approached slowly, noting the woman's disheveled appearance and unfocused gaze. "Yes, ma'am. We received a call about some concerns. Could you tell me who these children are?" "They're mine," Mrs. Walsh said, then corrected herself. "My great-grandchildren. Jennifer's children. She'll be back for them soon." The oldest boy spoke up, his voice quiet but clear. "Mom left us here 6 months ago. She said it was just for a week." Chun exchanged a glance with Torres, who was already radioing for CPS. She knelt down to the children's eye level. "Can you tell me your names?" "I'm Michael," the boy said. "This is Katie. She's 6 and Tommy's 4. He hesitated, then added, Gran tries her best, but she gets confused sometimes. She thinks we're her other children too." As if on cue, the recording of children's laughter started again, playing through hidden speakers. Mrs. Walsh smiled vaguely at the sound. "That's my Tommy too," she said. "From before." Charles set up the speakers so we could always hear them playing. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Child Protective Services arrived, along with paramedics to evaluate Mrs. Walsh. Chun supervised as Torres and another officer conducted a thorough search of the house, documenting the conditions and gathering evidence. The house told a story of gradual decline. The kitchen contained expired food and unwashed dishes. Upstairs, they found 3 children's beds in various states of disarray, along with a sophisticated sound system that played recordings at preset times throughout the day. But it was the attic that held the biggest surprise. A carefully preserved playroom contained toys and clothes from multiple decades, along with boxes of old recordings, vinyl records, reel-to-reel tapes, and cassettes, all meticulously labeled with dates and names. "Look at this," Torres called out, holding up a journal. She's been keeping daily logs for years. Lists of when her own kids played, what games they played, what they said. She recreated it all with the great-grandchildren. Same schedule, same games, same everything. Chun was examining a stack of more recent papers. "We've got bank statements here. The grandmother, Jennifer's mother, died last year and left everything to Mrs. Walsh. She's been living off that money, having groceries delivered, keeping the utilities on. She paused, reading further. But the accounts are almost empty now. A paramedic appeared in the attic doorway. "Detective, Mrs. Walsh is asking for you." She seems to be having a moment of clarity. Chun found Mrs. Walsh sitting on the living room sofa, looking suddenly older and very tired. The 3 children had been taken to the kitchen where a CPS worker was giving them fresh food and conducting preliminary interviews. "I know what year it is now," Mrs. Walsh said as Chun sat down across from her. 2025. Not 1962. Not 1975. Not any of the other years I've been living in. She twisted her hands in her lap. "Are they going to take the children?" "Yes, ma'am. At least temporarily. They need proper care while we sort this out. I tried to take care of them. I did. But the days, they stop making sense sometimes. Past and present, all mixed up together." She looked at Chun with surprising lucidity. "Will they go to jail? Jennifer and Charles Jr.? Charles Jr., my son, Jennifer's father. He knows where she is. He's been sending money sometimes, telling me to keep quiet about the children." Mrs. Walsh pulled a phone from her pocket, an old flip phone, and handed it to Chun. "The messages are all there. I think Jennifer's in trouble. The kind of trouble she's been in before. But Charles Jr. just wants to pretend everything's fine. Like he always has." Chun took the phone carefully. "We'll look into it, Mrs. Walsh. Right now, let's focus on getting you and the children the help you need." Mrs. Walsh nodded, then cocked her head as if listening. The recorded laughter had stopped, leaving the house in uncomfortable silence. "I always thought if I could just keep them all here, the past children, the present children, then nothing bad could happen. Nothing could change." She smiled sadly. "Silly, isn't it? Everything changes." Later, as Chun watched the CPS workers leading the children to their car, she noticed Sarah Mitchell still standing on the sidewalk, writing in her notebook. The girl looked up as Chun approached. "Did I do the right thing?" Sarah asked. "By telling?" Chun thought about the empty bank accounts, the expired food, the gradually deteriorating conditions that could have become dangerous. She thought about 3 children living in a time warp, trying to compete with ghosts from their great-grandmother's past. "Yes," she said firmly. "You absolutely did the right thing. You might have saved their lives." Sarah nodded, then looked back at her notebook. "What happens now?" "Now," Chun said, watching Mrs. Walsh being helped into an ambulance, "we try to put all the pieces back together. The real pieces, not the remembered ones." The girl wrote something down, then read aloud. The laughter stops, but the story continues. Chun couldn't have put it better herself. The Millbrook Police Department's conference room had become a makeshift command center for what the media was already calling the Walsh House case. Detective Chun sat surrounded by documents, photographs, and sticky notes, trying to construct a timeline that spanned 3 generations of family trauma. "Okay, walk me through it again," Captain Rivera said, studying the whiteboard where Chun had mapped out the Walsh family tree. "Start with the original recordings." Chun picked up the earliest dated journal. 1962 to 1975. Eleanor Walsh recorded her children playing Charles Jr., Margaret, and Rebecca. Every day, multiple times a day. At first, it seems like normal home recordings, the kind any mother might make. But after Charles Sr. installed the whole house sound system in '65, it became more systematic. She opened the journal to a marked page. Listen to this entry from December 1967. "Children's laughter must be preserved. When they grow up, they'll forget how to laugh like this. But I'll remember for them. I'll keep it safe." Torres entered with fresh coffee and a stack of financial records. "Got something on the grandson-in-law," he said, handing Chen a document. "Jennifer's husband, Mark Stevens. 3 rehab stints in the past decade, multiple arrests for possession. Last known address is a halfway house in Hartford. And Jennifer? Still no sign of her. But I tracked down her prescription history." Torres tapped his tablet. Multiple doctors, multiple pharmacies. Classic doctor shopping pattern. Oxycodone mainly. She was getting clean during her last pregnancy with Tommy, but relapsed about a year ago. Chun added this information to the timeline. The pattern was becoming clearer. 3 generations of a family trying to outrun their demons. Charles Jr., now a successful businessman in Boston, had spent his adult life distancing himself from his mother's increasing obsession with preserving the past. His own daughter, Jennifer, had fallen into addiction, possibly trying to escape the weight of her grandmother's fixation on childhood perfection. What about the children's father? Rivera asked. Mark Stevens is cooperating, Chun replied. Says Jennifer showed up at the halfway house 6 months ago, told him she'd left the kids with their great-grandmother temporarily. He assumed she meant for a weekend. Not. She gestured at the stack of evidence photos showing the children's living conditions. He didn't check on them. Says he wasn't allowed contact with the kids after his last relapse. Court orders. Chun rubbed her temples. The thing is, everyone involved thought someone else was handling it. Charles Jr. sent money but never visited. Mark assumed Jennifer had it under control. Jennifer's sister in California thought they were living with their father. Meanwhile, Mrs. Walsh's dementia was progressing, and 3 kids were living in a time capsule. Sarah Mitchell's detailed notebook had proved invaluable in establishing the pattern of decline. The girls' observations, spanning several weeks, showed how Mrs. Walsh's behavior had become increasingly erratic. The scheduled recordings had become more frequent, the boundaries between past and present children blurring in her mind. Chen's phone buzzed, a text from the children's temporary foster mother. She opened the attached photo and smiled despite the heaviness of the case. It showed Michael, Katie, and Tommy at the park, genuinely laughing for what might have been the first time in months. Real laughter, not the preserved echoes of their relatives from decades past. Dr. Harrison called from the geriatric psychiatric unit, Torres said, checking his notes. Mrs. Walsh is responding well to medication and therapy. She's more lucid, though she's having trouble processing what happened. Keeps apologizing to her old recordings, saying she failed to keep them safe. Chun stood up, stretching tired muscles. And Charles Jr.? Arriving tomorrow morning. His lawyer says he's willing to cooperate fully, probably hoping to avoid charges of child endangerment by proxy. Bring him straight to me, Chun said, studying the family tree again. I want to understand how it got this far. How an entire family could hear children's laughter for decades without realizing it had become a cry for help. Later that evening, Chun drove past the Walsh house. City workers had finally shut off the ancient sound system, but she could swear she still heard echoes of those recorded voices. Sarah Mitchell sat on her own front porch, writing in a new notebook. She waved as Chun passed. The detective waved back, thinking about how one child's attention to detail had saved 3 others. Sometimes it took an outsider to hear the wrong notes in what everyone else had accepted as normal background music. Her phone buzzed again, another update from the Foster family. Michael had asked for his great-grandmother's old copy of The Hardy Boys, not out of obligation this time, but simply because he wanted to know how the story ended. It was a small thing, Chun thought, but perhaps the beginning of his own story, one without scheduled performances or preserved perfection. Real stories, after all, were messy and unpredictable. They couldn't be captured in recordings or played on repeat. They had to be lived, moment by moment, with all their imperfect laughter and unexpected tears. Chun made a final note in her case file. The Walsh recordings have stopped. The healing can begin. Charles Walsh Jr. sat across from Detective Chun in the interview room, every inch the Boston executive in his tailored suit and carefully maintained silver hair. But his manicured hands couldn't stop fidgeting with his wedding ring, turning it around and around as he spoke about his daughter. Jennifer was always sensitive, he said, staring at the case photos spread across the table. Like my mother in that way. They both felt things too deeply. He picked up a school photo of Jennifer from her teenage years. All awkward smile embraces, trying too hard to please. I thought sending her to boarding school would help. Structure, you know? Distance from my mother's eccentricities. Chun let the silence stretch. Watching him struggle with memories he'd clearly worked hard to bury. Finally, he placed the photo back on the table with trembling fingers. "When did you last see your daughter?" Chun asked. "Christmas." "No, Thanksgiving." He frowned. She seemed better. The kids were clean, well-behaved. Mother was, well, more confused than usual, but she had good days still. Jennifer said they were just staying temporarily, until she found a new apartment. "Did you know your mother had been diagnosed with early-onset dementia 3 years ago?" Charles's head snapped up. "What? No, that's impossible. I spoke to her doctor." "Her former doctor," Chun corrected, sliding a report across the table. "She stopped attending appointments 2 years ago. Around the same time Jennifer relapsed." The color drained from Charles's face as he read the medical report. "Oh God," he whispered. "The money I sent, I thought it was for the kids' expenses. But she was paying for Jennifer's prescriptions. Wasn't she?" Among other things, Chun pulled out her phone, playing a voicemail recovered from Mrs. Walsh's old flip phone. Jennifer's voice, slurred and desperate, asking for more money, promising to come home soon, just a few more days, just until she got everything figured out. Charles put his head in his hands. "I didn't want to see it. Any of it. Just like when I was a kid. Easier to pretend everything was fine. That mother's recordings were normal, that Jennifer's headaches were really headaches." A knock at the door interrupted his self-recrimination. Officer Torres entered with a fresh report. "We found her," he said quietly. "Jennifer Stevens was discovered in a motel outside Hartford, unconscious but alive. The room was littered with empty pill bottles and a journal full of rambling apologies to her children. She'd been tracking them through social media, using a fake account to follow Sarah Mitchell's public posts about the mysterious house next door. She knew," Torres explained, reading from the journal. "She knew her grandmother was declining, that the kids weren't safe, but she couldn't face it. Says here she'd sit in her car down the street sometimes, listening to those same recordings she grew up with, trying to work up the courage to go in." Charles stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I need to see her. She's in intensive care," Chun said. "And when she's stable, she'll face charges. Child endangerment, prescription fraud. I'll pay for the best lawyers, the best rehab facility." Charles started, but Chun cut him off. "Mr. Walsh, throwing money at problems is what got us here. Your mother needed medical care, not just grocery delivery. Jennifer needed intervention, not secret prescriptions. Those kids needed a stable home, not a time capsule of preserved happiness." Charles sank back into his chair, suddenly looking every bit his 60 years. "What can I do?" "Help us understand," Chun said, softening her tone. "Start with the recordings. When did they begin? When did you first realize they weren't just home movies?" Over the next 2 hours, Charles unspooled a lifetime of carefully buried memories. His father installing the sound system as a gift, not realizing it would become the centerpiece of his wife's growing obsession. The scheduled playback times that structured their days. His mother's increasing insistence that happiness could be preserved if they just followed the routine, played the right recordings, recreated the perfect moments. "She meant well," he said finally. "She loved us so much it broke something in her. And then Jennifer inherited that broken piece, that need to make everything perfect even when it was falling apart. And the kids? Your grandchildren." Charles stared at the recent photos of Michael, Katie, and Tommy. "I'll do whatever you recommend. The right way this time. No shortcuts, no cover-ups." Chun nodded, making notes. "They need stability, professional help processing what they've been through. And eventually, when Jennifer's gotten proper treatment, supervised visitation might be possible. And my mother? The geriatric psychiatric unit is helping her adjust to medication. She's more lucid now, able to distinguish past from present. She asks about the children." Chun paused. "They miss her too, you know. Not the confused woman lost in old recordings, but the grandmother who read them stories and taught them about roses." Charles pulled out his wallet, removing a worn photograph. It showed a much younger Eleanor Walsh in her garden, laughing naturally as she played with a toddler Jennifer. No recordings, no scheduled performances, just a genuine moment of joy. "I'd forgotten she could laugh like that," he said softly. "Really laugh, not just playback echoes." "It's not too late," Chin said, "for any of them. But it needs to be real this time. No more preserved perfect moments. No more pretending everything's fine." Outside the interview room, Sarah Mitchell sat with her mother, giving a formal statement about her observations. The girl had become something of a local hero, her careful documentation helping piece together the timeline of deterioration that everyone else had missed. "Sometimes," Charles said, watching Sarah through the window, "it takes a child to remind us what real childhood should look like." Chun thought about Michael's recent request for art supplies, Katie's first playdate with Sarah, Tommy's delight in making new recordings of his own voice, not to preserve perfect moments, but simply to hear how silly he could make it sound. "The healing process will take time," she told Charles, "for all of them. But real healing is messy and imperfect. Can't be scheduled or preserved. It has to be lived." Charles nodded, finally stopping the nervous twisting of his ring. "Like real laughter," he said. "You can't really save it. You can only make room for more." The psychiatric ward of Hartford General was painted in what Jennifer Stevens assumed were supposed to be soothing colors, soft blues and gentle greens that reminded her of the nursery she'd painted for Tommy, back when she still believed she could be the kind of mother who got things right. She sat in the community room, watching rain trace patterns on the window while her group therapy session continued around her. "Jennifer," Dr. Patel's voice was gentle but insistent. "Would you like to share your thoughts about your children's visit yesterday?" She touched the craft paper bracelet on her wrist, a gift from Katie, covered in wobbly hearts and carefully written words. "Get better soon, Mom." Michael had added his own message in his neat handwriting. "We're okay. Take your time. They've grown," she said finally, her voice rough from disuse. "Tommy's almost as tall as Katie now. And Michael, he looks so much older. 6 months. She'd lost 6 months of their lives to a haze of pills and fear, leaving them in a house where time had stopped making sense. The guilt threatened to overwhelm her again, but she used the grounding techniques Dr. Patel had taught her, focusing on the present moment. "What else did you notice about them?" Dr. Patel prompted. "They're laughing again," Jennifer said, surprising herself with the observation. "Real laughing, not like..." She trailed off, remembering the recordings that had haunted her childhood, her grandmother's obsession with preserving perfect moments that never really existed. A nurse appeared in the doorway, gesturing to Dr. Patel. "Miss Stevens, your father is here." Jennifer's hands began trembling. She hadn't seen her father since that last Thanksgiving, when she'd still been pretending everything was under control. Dr. Patel noticed her anxiety. "Would you like to wait until tomorrow? There's no rush." But Jennifer shook her head. "No, I need to face this. All of it." Charles Walsh Jr. had lost weight. She noticed as he entered the room. The perfectly pressed suit couldn't hide how tired he looked, how the past months had aged him. He stood awkwardly by the door until she gestured to the chair across from her. "You look better," he said, then winced at his own words. "Better than unconscious in a motel room, you mean?" The bitterness surprised her. She'd practiced this conversation for weeks in therapy, but seeing him brought back every unresolved hurt. "Jenny?" He reached for her hand, then stopped himself. "I'm sorry. For everything. For not seeing what was happening. For teaching you to hide problems instead of facing them. Like you did with Grandma?" The words came out sharp, weighted with decades of carefully maintained silence. He didn't flinch. "Yes, exactly like that. I left you alone with her obsessions, just like my father left me alone with them. We all just pretended it was normal. Those endless recordings, the scheduled performances of happiness." Jennifer closed her eyes, remembering. "She made me play the same games they played in the recordings. Wear similar clothes. Learn the same songs. Said she was keeping childhood alive, but she was really trying to stop time. And then I sent you away to school instead of getting her help." "Instead of getting you help?" Charles's voice cracked. "When did the pills start?" Sophomore year. Headaches at first. Then anxiety. Then, she gestured vaguely, everything else. It was easier to float away than feel all the pressure to be perfect, to be preserved in amber like those recordings. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the rain. Finally, Charles spoke again. Your grandmother is doing better. The doctors say the medication is helping her distinguish past from present. She asks about you. Jennifer twisted Katie's bracelet around her wrist. I keep thinking about the kids, how I left them there knowing she was slipping. I told myself they were safe, that it was temporary, but really I just couldn't face any of it anymore. The social worker says they're resilient, Charles offered. The foster family is good for them. And Michael, he started writing his own stories. No more trying to live inside old ones. A memory surfaced. Michael at 6, listening intently to the ancient recordings while Grandma explained who each voice belonged to, what games they were playing, how everything was perfect back then. She'd seen him trying so hard to match those long-ago children, to be what his great-grandmother needed him to be. I have to break the cycle, Jennifer said firmly. For them. No more preserved perfect moments. No more pretending. No more running away into numbness. They deserve better. Dr. Patel, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. And what do you deserve, Jennifer? The question caught her off guard. She looked at her father, seeing the pain and regret in his eyes, the weight of 3 generations of unspoken trauma. I deserve to heal, she said slowly, to learn how to be present instead of perfect, to laugh with my children instead of making them perform happiness. Charles nodded, tears sliding down his cheeks. We all do. Later, after her father left, Jennifer sat with Dr. Patel reviewing her treatment plan. The road ahead was long therapy, addiction recovery, supervised visitation, rebuilding trust. But for the first time, she felt anchored in reality instead of drowning in preserved echoes of the past. Your daughter Katie, Dr. Patel said, she told me something interesting yesterday. She said she likes your new laugh better than your old one. My new laugh? Yes. She said it sounds more real, like you really mean it. Jennifer touched the paper bracelet again, tracing the wobbly hearts. Outside, the rain had stopped, and weak sunlight filtered through the hospital windows. Somewhere in Millbrook, her children were living their own unscripted moments, creating their own authentic sounds of joy. It was time, she decided, to learn how to join them in the present. Michael sat cross-legged on his new bedroom floor, carefully arranging his collection of Hardy Boys books in chronological order. Through the open window of the foster home, he could hear Tommy and Katie playing in the backyard with their foster siblings, their laughter mixing with the natural sounds of a summer afternoon lawnmowers, birds, the ice cream truck's distant jingle. No schedules, no recordings, no prescribed moments of joy. Hey, buddy, Mark Wilson, his foster father, appeared in the doorway. Sarah's here to see you. Michael looked up to see Sarah Mitchell hovering behind Mr. Wilson, clutching her ever-present notebook and what looked like some kind of electronic device. I brought something, she said, stepping into the room. If you want to see it, Mr. Wilson smiled. I'll be downstairs if you need anything. Once he left, Sarah sat down next to Michael, placing her notebook and what he now recognized as a digital voice recorder between them. Mrs. Rodriguez helped me get it, she explained. I thought maybe you might want to record your own stories? Michael stared at the recorder, his throat tight. For a moment, all he could hear were the old recordings from the Victorian house, the endless loop of preserved laughter, the voices from the past demanding to be matched, repeated, preserved. It's okay if you don't want to, Sarah added quickly. I just thought, no, I do, Michael interrupted. But different. Not like before. He picked up the recorder, turning it over in his hands. Can I show you something? He retrieved a notebook from under his bed. Not the strict daily logs his great-grandmother had kept, but a blank one given to him by his therapist, Dr. Lewis. Inside were his attempts at writing stories, mostly adventures starring his siblings, but with no prescribed endings, no perfect moments to preserve. I've been writing about us, he explained. About what happened, but also about what happens next. Real stories. Sarah's eyes lit up. Like the Hardy Boys, but about you guys? Kind of. Michael flipped through the pages. But not just solving mysteries. It's about learning to be normal kids again. Tommy had a tantrum at the grocery store last week, and Mrs. Wilson just helped him calm down. She didn't try to make him be quiet or perfect. She said it's okay to have big feelings. Can I read some? Michael hesitated, then nodded. As Sarah read, he could hear Katie teaching their new foster sister a clapping game in the backyard. It wasn't the same game from the old recordings. This one had different rhythms. Wrong words, imperfect timing. It was better. These are really good, Sarah said finally. Especially the part about Tommy discovering he likes spicy food. Gran never let him try it. Did she? She only made the foods her kids liked in the recordings, Michael explained. But now, he smiled slightly. Now we get to figure out what we actually like. Sarah picked up her voice recorder again. Maybe we could record you reading these? Not to preserve them or anything, but just to show how stories can change and grow. Downstairs, the front door opened, and Michael heard Dr. Chen's voice talking with the Wilsons. She visited regularly, keeping them updated about their mom's progress in the hospital, their great-grandmother's treatment, their grandfather's efforts to make amends. They're all getting better, Dr. Chen had told him last week. And you know why? Because they're finally letting themselves be imperfect. Michael reached for the recorder. Okay, he said, but let's start with a new story. About today, he pressed record and began. The thing about real laughter is that you can't schedule it. It just happens, like Tommy discovering he loves wasabi peas, or Katie making up songs that don't rhyme, or me learning that sad stories can have happy middles even if you don't know the ending yet. Sarah opened her notebook, but instead of her usual detailed observations, she began sketching the sunlight through the window, Tommy's face smeared with ice cream, Katie's mismatched socks. Keep going, she encouraged. So Michael did, letting the story unfold naturally, without trying to match it to any preserved moment from the past. He recorded the sound of Katie's new clapping game, Tommy's delighted shriek as he bit into another wasabi pea, the Wilsons' patient voices asking what they wanted for dinner. When Dr. Chen came upstairs to check on them, she found Michael and Sarah surrounded by books and papers, the voice recorder capturing their quiet conversation about endings and beginnings, about the difference between preserving moments and living them. Time for dinner, she announced. I brought pizza. With pineapple? Tommy called from the hallway, where he'd been listening. Gran said pineapple doesn't belong on pizza, but I want to try it. Half pineapple, Dr. Chen confirmed, and half whatever else you want to discover. Michael picked up the voice recorder, but instead of stopping it, he let it keep running, capturing the sounds of chairs scraping, plates clinking, his siblings debating pizza toppings, Sarah explaining why she thought pineapple and pepperoni could work together. Real life, real laughter, real stories, no schedules required. Later, when Sarah asked if he wanted to erase the dinner recording to save space, Michael shook his head. No, he said. I want to keep it. Not because it's perfect, but because it's true, and that he was learning made all the difference. The geriatric psychiatric unit at Millbrook General had a garden. Not an elaborate one like Eleanor Walsh's prized rose beds, but a simple space with raised planters and comfortable benches. On this crisp September morning, Eleanor sat with her social worker, Ms. Reeves, watching a monarch butterfly explore the late-blooming zinnias. Are you ready for today? Ms. Reeves asked, checking her notes. We can reschedule if you're feeling overwhelmed. Eleanor smoothed her cardigan new, chosen by herself from the hospital shop, not a preserved relic from decades past. No, she said firmly. I need to see them. The real them, not the memories. The medication had helped clear the fog that had mixed past and present so completely. Therapy had helped her understand her desperate need to preserve perfect moments, to keep her children forever young and happy through the endless loop of recordings. But nothing had been harder than accepting that her great-grandchildren needed to be their own people, not replacements for long-gone voices on ancient tapes. Remember your coping strategies, Ms. Reeves said gently. And if you feel yourself slipping, I focus on something present and concrete, Eleanor finished. the texture of my sweater, the smell of coffee, the sound of real voices, not recorded ones. The butterfly landed on her hand, wings slowly opening and closing. Eleanor watched it, anchoring herself in the moment. No schedule, no performance, just the simple reality of being. "They're here," Ms. Reeves said softly. Eleanor looked up to see Michael, Katie, and Tommy entering the garden with their foster parents, the Wilsons. Dr. Chen followed close behind, along with Charles Jr., who had flown in from Boston for this supervised visit. Tommy saw her first. Gran. He started forward, then stopped, looking uncertainly at Mrs. Wilson. "It's okay," Mrs. Wilson said. "Remember what we talked about? Real feelings are okay." Tommy ran to Eleanor, wrapping his arms around her waist. She hugged him back, noticing how much he'd grown. The new freckles on his nose, the way he smelled of peanut butter and little boy sweat instead of the carefully preserved cleanliness she'd once insisted upon. "You got new clothes," Katie observed, approaching more cautiously. She touched the soft blue cardigan. "Not the old dresses anymore." "No more old dresses," Eleanor agreed. "No more old anything. Just me as I am now." Michael hung back, studying her with those observant eyes that reminded her so much of her late husband. "The recording stopped," he said. "In the house. Sarah told me they turned off the sound system." Eleanor felt the familiar urge to reassure him, to promise that they could recreate those perfect moments again. Instead, she took a deep breath and said what she'd practiced with her therapist. "Yes, those recordings were memories, not life. I got lost in them for a while, trying to keep everyone safe in Amber. But you deserve to make your own sounds, your own memories." Michael's shoulders relaxed slightly. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a digital recorder. "I've been making new recordings," he said. "Not to preserve anything, just to tell stories. Real ones. Would you like to hear?" They sat together on the garden bench, the butterfly still occasionally fluttering nearby, and listened to Michael's clear voice reading his latest story. It was about 3 children discovering their own ways of being happy, with a grandmother who learned to love them as they were, not as echoes of the past. Charles Jr. wiped tears from his eyes as he listened. "Dad would have loved this," he said quietly to Eleanor. "He always said Michael had the gift for stories." "Charles," Eleanor reached for her son's hand. "I'm sorry for making you and your sisters live inside those recordings for so long. For teaching Jennifer to chase perfect moments instead of real ones. Mom, I'm sorry too. For not seeing how much help you needed. For letting history repeat itself with Jennifer and the kids." Tommy, who had been chasing the butterfly, came running back. Gran, can I tell you about wasabi peas? They're spicy and amazing, and I eat them all the time now." Eleanor laughed, a real laugh, unscheduled and imperfect. "Tell me everything." They spent the next hour sharing stories. Katie's new friendship with Sarah Mitchell, Michael's adventures in creative writing, Tommy's culinary discoveries. The Wilsons added their own observations about the children's progress, while Dr. Chen shared updates about Jennifer's recovery. "She's doing well," Dr. Chen said, "taking it one day at a time. The doctors think she might be ready for supervised visits next month." Eleanor noticed how Michael tensed slightly at this news. "It's okay to have mixed feelings," she told him. "About all of us. We broke your trust, and earning it back will take time." "Dr. Lewis says the same thing," Michael replied. "About trust being like a house. Sometimes you have to tear down the broken parts before you can rebuild stronger." A nurse appeared to signal the end of visiting hours. As the children prepared to leave, Tommy hugged Eleanor again. "Will you tell me about the roses next time?" he asked. "Not like before, but maybe you could teach me to grow new ones?" "I'd like that very much," Eleanor said. New roses, new stories, new memories. She watched them leave her son, her great-grandchildren, the caring professionals who had helped unravel her web of preserved perfection. The butterfly made one last circuit around the garden before flying away. Ms. Reeves touched her shoulder. "How are you feeling?" Eleanor considered the question carefully, focusing on the present moment as she'd been taught. "Sad," she said honestly, "but a clean kind of sad. Like pruning roses, it hurts, but it makes room for new growth. As if to punctuate her words, she heard laughter from the parking lot, real, spontaneous laughter as Tommy presumably did something amusing. No recordings needed. Some moments, Eleanor was finally learning, were more beautiful precisely because they couldn't be preserved. 1 year after Sarah Mitchell first heard the mysterious laughter next door, she sat in her window seat watching movers load the last of Mrs. Walsh's furniture into their truck. The Victorian house stood quiet now, its windows open to the autumn breeze, ready for its new owners. "It looks different, doesn't it?" Mrs. Rodriguez said, joining Sarah at the window. The counselor had become a regular visitor, helping Sarah process her role in the events that had unfolded. Happier, Sarah decided, opening her final notebook about the Walsh house. Like it can breathe again. She'd filled 12 notebooks over the past year, documenting everything. The investigation, the children's transition to foster care, Mrs. Walsh's recovery, Jennifer's rehabilitation, and most importantly, the family's slow journey toward healing. The latest entry described yesterday's gathering, a small celebration of Michael's 13th birthday in the Wilsons' backyard. Mrs. Walsh had been there, looking years younger in her casual clothes, helping Tommy plant his first rose bush. Jennifer had attended too, 6 months sober and cautiously rebuilding relationships with her children. Even Charles Jr. had flown in, bringing birthday presents and humble attempts at connection. "Did you record it?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked, nodding at the voice recorder that Sarah and Michael still shared for their storytelling projects. "Some," Sarah said. "The important parts. Like when Tommy accidentally sprayed everyone with the garden hose, and Mrs. Walsh just laughed instead of worrying about perfect moments. Or when Katie showed Jennifer her art portfolio, and nobody cared that the drawings weren't exactly right. She pressed play, and Michael's voice filled the room. The thing about happy endings is that they're really just new beginnings in disguise. Like when your mom comes home different, still broken in some places but trying to heal. Or when your great-grandmother learns to love the messy parts of life as much as the perfect ones. Or when your grandfather stops trying to fix everything with money and just listens instead. A knock at the door interrupted the recording. It was Detective Chun, holding a small cardboard box. "Found these during the final sweep of the house," she said, setting the box on Sarah's desk. "Thought you might want them for your records." Inside were the original tapes from 1962, Mrs. Walsh's first recordings of her children playing. Sarah handled them carefully, these artifacts that had sparked decades of preservation attempts. "Mrs. Walsh asked us to donate most of the recordings to a historical society," Chun explained. "But she wanted you to have these. Said something about keeping them safe but not preserved, whatever that means." Sarah understood. These weren't instructions for perfect happiness anymore, just memories of real moments, no more or less precious than the new ones being created every day. Through her window, she could see Michael in his foster family's yard next door, reading to his siblings under the maple tree. Their laughter floated up, natural, unscheduled, alive. "I have one last story to tell," Sarah said, picking up her pencil. "About how sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop trying to keep everything the same. About how love doesn't need to be preserved because it's always growing into new shapes." She wrote the date at the top of a fresh page, then paused. "Detective Chun, do you think they'll be okay?" "All of them." Chun thought about Jennifer, now working part-time and attending every therapy session. About Mrs. Walsh tending her new, smaller garden with acceptance of its seasonal changes. About Charles Jr. learning to face problems instead of burying them. About 3 children discovering who they were beyond the weight of family history. "I think," she said carefully, "they're learning that okay doesn't mean perfect. It means real." Sarah nodded and began to write. The Walsh house stands quiet now, its rooms empty of recordings but full of echoes. Not the old echoes of preserved laughter, but the kind that remind us that every story has many chapters. The sad ones make the happy ones sweeter. The broken pieces make the healing possible. And sometimes the most beautiful sounds are the ones we don't try to capture at all. Outside, Michael's voice drifted up again, reading a new story to his siblings. Tommy interrupted with questions, Katie added her own plot suggestions, and none of it was perfect. It was better than that. It was true. Sarah closed her notebook and joined them under the maple tree, leaving her window open to catch the autumn breeze. Somewhere in the distance, children were laughing, real children, making new memories that would not be recorded or scheduled or preserved. And that was exactly as it should be.